Mr. Speaker, it's a real pleasure for myself to rise today to address what I believe is a very important motion. It should be a wake-up to the government, in particular the Prime Minister and the staff within the PMO's office, that their behaviour towards federalism and their attitudes in terms of, or lack thereof, of recognizing their responsibility to work with provinces by not having premier conferences with the First Minister is just wrong. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take the opportunity to add a few thoughts that I have in regards to why I believe that they are of critical importance, having First Ministerial meetings. My colleague, my seatmate, pointed out to me, Mr. Speaker, that 1906 is when, in fact, we had our first Minister's meeting, and that this particular Prime Minister has not had a First Minister's meeting since January of 2009. I do believe that it is a loss of opportunities, Mr. Speaker, by the Prime Minister not recognizing the importance of First Minister meetings. And what I thought I would do is focus on maybe a couple of agenda items right up at the get-go in terms of why it is that the Prime Minister has missed the boat in terms of not going forward with the First Minister's meeting. We've heard a lot about the economy over the last little while, primarily because of the fall in the oil prices. We hear from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance that the situation in Canada's economy is such that there's so much uncertainty that they cannot even provide a budget date, Mr. Speaker. They've put off the budget. We believe it will be sometime in April that it will most likely come out. And yet, Mr. Speaker, you take a look at it, and if the economy and the forecasting is in such a situation in which they had to defer the budget, one would question, well, why wouldn't the Prime Minister want to meet with the provincial premiers to talk about that particular issue? We've now known about this for a number of months. The impact of the falling oil prices will have an impact on each and every province, Mr. Speaker. We're all concerned about the state of Canada's economy and the impact that it's having on not only our national budget, but also on the provincial budgets. You'll find, Mr. Speaker, that when the federal government provides its national budget, usually a number of weeks that follow, you will then start seeing provinces providing their budgets. And it's because, in good part, there's a heavy reliance on knowing how and much money the government is investing into social programming, the safety nets that are there, and federal budgetary decisions do have a fairly significant impact on the provincial budgets. Given the delay, I would ultimately argue, Mr. Speaker, that in itself could be justification in terms of the Prime Minister wanting to meet with the premiers to get a better sense of what's happening in the different regions of the country and how a united front with the different levels of government could have a more positive impact for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, if you tag into that the issue of infrastructure. Infrastructure has been a serious issue for months now within the Liberal Party, where we have been asking questions about the government's, dating all the way going back to the federal government's last federal budget, in terms of the serious cuts that were being put into place, Mr. Speaker, for actual expenditures this year and the year coming up, 16, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we know it is having a very profound impact on virtually every community of our country. There is a need for us to get a better understanding. If you take that into consideration along with the government's approach on the delay of the national budget, There's a second item that could easily be placed on a national agenda where you have the premiers coming to the table with the Prime Minister. I can assure you that the premiers all have issues related to infrastructure expenditures, Mr. Speaker. Timing is important. Timing does matter. Infrastructure is investing in our country, yet the government seems to be more interested in the election cycle than they are in the infrastructure needs of our country. And I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that if the Prime Minister were to meet with the premiers, that he would be told fairly clearly where premiers, and no doubt I would like to think that the Prime Minister has also met with some of our mayors and so forth and municipal leaders, I believe have a shared concern in regards to the amount of monies that are necessary in order to meet our infrastructure needs and where that money needs to come from, at least in part, in order for us to realize the benefits of investing in priority infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker. When you talk about a First Minister's meeting, not all of the work is done during that actual meeting. There's a great deal of effort, I would argue a majority of effort, that is put in, invested in the lead-up to the discussion. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, if you were to talk about infrastructure, I suspect what you would have is municipal leaders working with the province and federal bureaucracy and trying to get a better assessment of what all the needs in the different regions of the country are, so that when the First Ministers sit down for the discussion, if you placed infrastructure on that agenda, that it would be a very wholesome discussion. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that that is one of the ways in which you can actually build the consensus so that provinces as a whole feel that they're all being treated equally, that they feel that they're being listened to, and then there's a sense that there is a united front as to how much money should be spent in any given fiscal year, given our economic circumstance. You cannot, I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, have that comprehensive discussion and amount of dialogue by parceling it out. I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, if you wanted to have a national strategy on infrastructure, one of the best ways that you could achieve that is by bringing the premiers to the table. And a Prime Minister that was confident of his or her abilities, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't be intimidated by the asks that would be put on the table by the different partners of our federation. Doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government's only role is just to dole out money. No, we have a federal civil service that is the best in the world, I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that has the ability to be able to get that assessment from a federal treasury perspective and from a community perspective also by working with the different civil servants at the different levels of government, so that the federal government would be very well represented. But if you want to build the consensus, Mr. Speaker, in terms of having that national program, quite often it's best had at a First Minister's conference. And we have seen great successes to that effect. I'd like to give a real example, one in which I've had the opportunity to talk about in the past, and that is in regards to health care. I'm very passionate about healthcare because I believe it's a part of our Canadian identity. And if you talk to Canadians and you ask them what makes them feel good about living in Canada or being a Canadian or a resident of Canada, quite often the number one answer you'll get is a reflection on our healthcare system. That is the reason why we brought it in decades ago and why it is that Pierre Trudeau brought in the Health Care Act. You know, when we talk about that as an important issue to Canadians, I remember the 90s when there were First Ministers' conferences when Mr. Chrétien, the former Prime Minister, had premiers come to the table and members will say, well, yeah, well, that's when the Liberals cut back on health transfers. Well, I was sitting in a provincial legislature debating the issue at the time, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you the biggest issue from Manitoba's perspective that I would argue was we had a fear in the province of Manitoba that there was a previous agreement that had tax points financing health care, and that if you didn't change the formula, that it was only a question of time before Ottawa wouldn't be having financial cash transfers. It'll all go into tax point transfers. And I, as a provincial legislator at the time, was saying, I want cash coming from Ottawa. And that is something, I believe, that was actually talked about because we asked our Premier back then to raise the issue with the Prime Minister. And we take it for, and maybe I shouldn't take it for granted, but Mr. Speaker, I take it for granted that it was raised. It's one of the things that I believe that Jean Chrétien did a great thing for Canadians by ensuring that there would always be an ongoing cash transfer to the provinces.
Absolutely.
That was a strong statement of policy, and it was in response to what I believe Canadians wanted of their governments, not just the national government, but for the provincial governments also, Mr. Speaker. Fast forward it to when we had Paul Martin as the leader and Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, of Canada. We're all familiar with the Health Care Accord. The Health Care Accord was achieved at a First Minister's meeting. It's the Prime Minister sitting down with the different premiers. And whether it was Pierre Trudeau, whether it was Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, too, understood how important this issue was to all Canadians. And what did they, in essence, come up with, Mr. Speaker? A 10-year health care accord that guaranteed finances, but it also wanted to make sure that there is some opportunity for Ottawa to have some influence in terms of the ways in which healthcare is ultimately being delivered, if the government was wanting to ensure some sort of a sense of accountability. And if you canvass your constituents, or if members canvass their constituent, they will find, and there's no doubt because, Mr. Speaker, I send out questionnaires and I'm constantly consulting with my constituents, they want Ottawa to be playing a role in health care. Paul Martin recognized that. And the best way in order to deal with that issue was to be able to talk about it in the Premier's conference. So he sat down with the premiers and he comes up with this wonderful agreement. And as one of my colleagues made reference to earlier, every other week when we're sitting, you'll often hear of a Conservative member of the caucus talk, oh, how wonderful we are because we're giving so much money towards health care. Well, the dollars that they're referring to, Mr. Speaker, is the dollars that Paul Martin negotiated with the premiers over a decade ago at a First Minister's conference. That's the benefits. You know, when you think of constitutional discussions or First Ministerial meetings, one of the reasons why I got intrigued and involved in politics was because of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. In the constitutional discussion, we have the Charter of Rights, we have our own Constitution. Why? Because we had a Prime Minister that had a vision that saw Canada as an independent nation, and we needed to be able to have our own Constitution. I took a great deal of pride in that, Mr. Speaker. And again, it would not have happened if there had not been First Ministers getting together to look for and achieve a national goal or a national issue. We could talk about the Kelowna Accord. You know, the issues that are there today in the Aboriginal community are severe and serious. The Kelowna Accord was a massive accomplishment of Paul Martin, where he got premiers, First Nation leaders, and others coming together, working together, and at the end of the day, they produced a document in which Canadians as a whole supported, I believe, Mr. Speaker. And the Chamber, with the exception of the Conservatives, I suspect, supported, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, these agreements, these accords, are something in which I believe are best achieved when you have a government that is not intimidated by attending premiers or first ministers' meetings, but rather by a prime minister who has some vision, some sense in terms of what he or she would like to see the country look like into the future. And that's why I'm so proud that the leader of the Liberal Party has made the commitment to ensure that we will have First Minister meetings going into the future, Mr. Speaker. And we should. I know one of the issues that, and I suspect my leader doesn't need to be lobbied on, is the issue of CPP, our Canada Pension Plan. Mr. Speaker, the Canada Pension Plan is an issue in which Canadians from every region are concerned about, coast to coast to coast. We understand the value of that program. It's only the Conservatives in this House that seem to want to turn a deaf ear to what Canadians are saying about the issue of pensions. We now have at least one province, and I believe one of the NDP Premier leadership candidates was even talking about going alone on a CPP. There might be others that are talking about it, but let there be no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that there are a number of provinces that would support a First Minister's meeting to deal with our pensions for our seniors. Whether it's the OAS and the government's desire to increase the age from 65 to 67 for retirement, or the need for us to invest more in the CPP plan. These are the types of issues that can ultimately make a difference in the day-to-day life of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, what they want is strong leadership coming out of the Prime Minister's office. I believe that this Prime Minister doesn't have a national vision on the different issues that are out there. He takes issues day by day and makes decisions without consultation, Mr. Speaker. And the OAS is a great example of that. He's overseas and he comes back, or while he's out somewhere in Europe, he says, well, we're going to increase the age from 65 to 67. No real consultation at all, Mr. Speaker. Then he comes down, then he comes to Canada, and you sense the reaction. Well, the Liberal Party is going to correct it, Mr. Speaker. We're going to leave it at 65. We're going to meet with the different premiers to talk about the CPP because we're concerned about pensions. We understand and we know that the people of Canada want good pensions when they start retiring, Mr. Speaker. And the Liberal Party is committed to working with the premiers, because if you're not prepared to work with the premiers collectively, you're not going to be able to achieve some of the things in which Canadians want. So by supporting this motion, what you're really saying is that you support the idea that there's a role, and an important role, for our national government to be able to build consensus and make a real difference in the lives of each and every person that calls Canada their home, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and for Intergovernmental Affairs.